Okay, again, welcome this morning to the 10 o'clock forum. And I'm Rob Hartman. Pleasure of being on the vestry here and also in charge of the 150th. And today we have a fabulous forum for the 150th. Church Consecrations in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, an art and music presentation. 150 years ago, this church was consecrated with music and ceremony. And today we will learn about church consecration ceremonies in the past and how they were highly symbolic events that combined architecture, liturgy, and music. Closer to the mic, our host today is Joanne Allen, a parishioner at St. John's. And when she's not singing in our choir and doing a lot of other things here at the church, she is the Hearst Senior Professional Lecturer in Art History at American University. Welcome, Joanne.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. I've been looking forward to this for so long, and it's really a pleasure to be with you and with everyone on Zoom as well. As Rob said, went through my mind about the consecration of St. John's, which would have been a much more modest affair than the sort of consecrations that I'm going to be talking about today that date from the Middle Ages and Renaissance. Yes, so church consecrations, originally it would just be a mass, like a very sort of elaborate mass. And then gradually in the early Middle Ages, really starting from the 8th century onwards, we start to get some more different types of ceremonies being part of this overall event. Things like depositing relics in the altar, asperging the church with holy water, and putting chrism or holy oil crosses on the altar and the whole church. And in these manuscript illuminations, the one on the left, you can see the bishop there setting up these consecration crosses, and then the acolytes and choir around. And then on the right, you can see the bishop in the mitre, and he's asperging the church with holy water. But then around the 9th century, we have the development of a very unique ceremony called the alphabet ceremony. So this is really, really fascinating. And so what would happen was at the beginning of the whole ceremony to consecrate the church, and remember this ceremony, this is to set aside a place of being a holy place for worship. So it's really, really symbolic. What would happen is at the beginning of the ceremony, the bishop would place 12 candles around the church. He would prostrate before the altar, and then we would have the alphabet ceremony. So what happens with this is that ash would be laid out on the ground of the church floor, in these two lines, and they form a type of cross. A diagonal cross, and they intersect in the center of the church. And along one of these lines, the bishop would take his crozier, and he'd take the end of it, and he would use that as a writing implement, and he would write into this ash, first of all, the Latin alphabet, and then the Greek alphabet on the other line, and they would intersect. So you can see on the left the Pontificale Romanum, which is the liturgical guidebook for the Catholic Church. Can you see on the left there is a depiction of what should go on in this alphabet ceremony? And then on the right, the dedication of Westminster Cathedral in 1910 is a photograph of it. So that's a Catholic cathedral. So evidently they were still doing this even in the 20th century. And it's a really amazing idea, isn't it? You've probably never heard of this alphabet ceremony. When I first heard about this, I was like, wow, this is something quite unique. And I want to show you this one as well. Yes, here is an image actually from the Renaissance era on the right, Urban VIII consecrating New St. Peter's. So if we think about this alphabet ceremony, it's got the ashes, it's got the letters, it's got the image of the cross. And so it's very, very symbolic. And I mean, the ashes can represent the idea of penance, the idea of the church sort of coming from the ground. You know, we say that in the funeral ceremonies, don't we? The ashes to ashes and dust to dust. So we've got the idea of penance. We've also got the idea of the church building being associated with the actual human body, in the same way that you cross yourself to kind of sanctify yourself. It's almost like the whole church as a body is receiving that cross. There's also the idea of evangelizing outside the church as well, because these four corners where the cross ends up, in the sort of northeast, southeast parts of the church, they're going to represent the four corners of the earth to which we should evangelize. So there's quite a few different kind of images, associations with that. And then these two languages, so Latin and Greek. And so we can think about like the origins of the Bible with the Greek language, maybe less so the Latin that came a bit later. But I did read that they could represent two of the origins of the church, being the Jews and the Gentiles, and the way they sort of intersect, maybe representing Christ. So there's quite a lot to it. It's very, very symbolic. I'm just obsessed with the alphabet ceremony. Urban VIII here consecrating St. Peter's Basilica. This happened in 1626. This was New St. Peter's. If you've been to Rome, you will have seen the huge dome of Michelangelo. This was a church that went back to the 300s, commissioned by Constantine the Great. But by the time New St. Peter's had been built, that's about 1300 years later, this guy, Urban VIII, there was actually no need for him to consecrate the church because it had been in continuous use. But he wanted the splendor of doing this ceremony himself. And so he did the alphabet ceremony, and it's commemorated in these tapestries commissioned by his descendants a bit later on. And he was a pope who really loved pomp and ceremony, and he actually commissioned Bernini's Baldacchino that you can see there that gives the altar in St. Peter's just this sense of majesty. So what I really want us to focus on is the consecration of Florence Cathedral. So this took place in 1436, and it was a very unique event. I'm going to tell you a bit about the church and then the piece of music that was performed at this ceremony. The four of us from St. John's Choir are going to perform that for you today. And it's a very, very rarely heard piece of music, so I hope you will enjoy that. So Florence Cathedral, it had been around since the Middle Ages, but then in 1296, it was begun to be rebuilt in this grand Gothic style. And you can see from the image on the lower right, this fresco depicting the proposed cathedral as it would be in sort of the minds of the Florentine populace from the 1360s. And you can see from that image that it has a huge dome. However, they laid out the cathedral in such a large area that where the dome was going to be basically the largest dome ever created in masonry. And so no one really knew how to do this dome until Brunelleschi. So the famous architect who had trained as a goldsmith, he had traveled to Rome and he had studied classical architecture. And he'd revived some of the mathematics of ancient architecture. And it was he who came up with the solution for the dome of the cathedral. And for that dome, he drew on medieval precedents and also classical precedents. So he looked at the baptistries in Florence and Pisa, the top two images here, and both of them have got a double dome, and also they use quite a steep profile for the dome, and so it's more of the Gothic arch shape, which is a stronger design because it pushes the forces of the architecture more vertically down than horizontally. You can also see that Gothic influence in the ribs. So those white lines coming down on the dome, kind of holding the whole thing together. But then he also looked at classical architecture, something like the Pantheon that you see at the bottom right, the Temple of Minerva Medica that no longer exists. From the Pantheon, he got the idea of building up that dome in a series of horizontal courses. And then from the Temple of Minerva, he got the idea of using herringbone pattern in the brickwork that created a very strong structure. And so when it was completed, minus that lantern on top that came just a little bit later, it was considered to be basically one of the wonders of the world. It really came at a time of Florentine dominance politically and economically with the Medici family, and sort of the growing naturalism in the arts, growing sort of burgeoning Renaissance art. And so it was really considered to be a huge statement on behalf of Florentine civic pride. And it just so happened that at that time, the Pope Eugenius IV, lived in Florence. And so he was asked to consecrate the cathedral. I'll talk a little bit in a second about why he was living in Florence. And it was dedicated on the 25th of March, 1436. Does anyone know what the 25th of March is in the Catholic calendar? Yes, Laura. Lady Day. And what does Lady Day mean? It's the Feast of the Annunciation. Because when they started to rebuild Florence Cathedral, they switched the dedication. It was previously dedicated to a Roman martyr saint called Reparata, but instead they dedicated it to the Virgin Mary, but the Virgin Mary of the Flowers, Santa Maria del Fiore. And so they asked Eugenius to consecrate it, and Cosimo de' Medici, the famous banker and de facto ruler of Florence at this time, he convinced Eugenius to perform this consecration and to extend an indulgence to the people of Florence. And Guillaume de Fay's Nuper Rosarum Flores was performed, which we will do in a few minutes. So why was Eugenius in Florence at this time? Well, the popes actually hadn't been in Rome consistently in the later Middle Ages. We had something called the Babylonian captivity of the papacy in Avignon. That had been from 1309 to 76. Basically, they elected a French pope and he refused to leave France. So the papacy stayed in France for like 70 years. Then we had the Western Schism with popes and anti-popes at the same time. But then from 1417, Martin V actually ruled from Rome. Eugenius, he was from Venice originally, and he did set up in Rome in 1431. However, there were some uprisings in Rome against his family, and so he escaped to Florence, and he stayed there for 10 years. And he lived in the Dominican convent of Santa Maria Novella. If you've been to Florence, you'll know that phrase because that's where the train station is. And you can see that on the plan just at the lower right. And as part of this ceremony of consecration, they actually constructed a raised wooden bridge between Santa Maria Novella and the Duomo. And so you would have seen the Pope walking on this little bridge, sort of raised up. I imagine it being something like when in Venice there are the floods, they kind of raise you up a little bit. But as the populace of Florence, you would be able to see the Pope and his entourage go by nicely. And So, yes, he was invited to do this. Yes. His real name, so Eugenius was his papal name, but his real name was Gabriele Colduma, so Gabriel. So you're like, oh, wasn't he involved in the Annunciation in some way? Here are some images of Gabriel with Mary. And so imagine Gabriel coming to the Church of Mary. It's almost like a symbolic type of annunciation being replayed in the contemporary world. Added to that is the first line that David and I are going to sing is all about this rose that Eugenius gave to the city of Florence. I'm just showing an example of what it might have looked like there. The golden rose, the golden papal rose. And these papal roses, they were given by a pope to a particular place to convey honor on that place. And you can see the images of Gabriel. He brings a flower to the Virgin Mary, and Gabriel, the Pope, is bringing a flower to Florence. Before I forget to mention it, the word Florence is related to the word flower, flourishing. So it's very, very symbolic. Our composer, Guillaume Dufay, was French. He was educated at Cambrai Cathedral, and he worked at Rimini and Bologna, then in Rome, and he was the master of the papal choir. So he would be in Florence with Eugenius. And it seems that he wrote the poem that the motet sets to music. So if you have a handout, now is the time to look at that handout. Because the poem that we're going to sing, it's very, very unusual because it commemorates this one event that took place on this one day. And this is why we would never sing this for you in St. John's Choir. It's completely not relevant to like anything apart from this ceremony. So I'm so grateful to my colleagues here for indulging me and learning this incredibly difficult piece of music to sing for you all. But have a look at the translation here on the right. It starts off talking about how Eugenius is bringing this rose to the city, to this temple of the grandest structure. He's talking about Brunelleschi's dome here. And this is one of the few examples of Renaissance music talking about architecture. But it's piously and devoutly dedicated to the Heavenly Virgin. And then the second verse, today, hodie. Actually today, Eugenius is going to consecrate this enormous temple. And therefore, the populace of Florence is praying to the Virgin Mary and to her son, that they may be worthy to receive gracious benefits and forgiveness of sins. So this whole poem is very symbolic. It has got some repeated words in there. The word Virgo is repeated a few times, virgin. The idea of the temple, the church, the grandis templum, amplissimum, very large templum. And then we have got Eugenius is brought out, and also Florentiae, so Florence. So we're really in this hodie, we're here today. And Dufay, he brings that out in the music as well. So for amplissimum, for example, is one of the highest parts of the music. So I'm going to sing something like so it's kind of quite high. And then for Eugenius, the part there is more regular. So it actually comes out in all this polyphony. Eugenius. And similarly for Florentiae, Florentiae. So you might hear those things coming out. But it also has got sacred numbers in this text. There are 4 stanzas of the poem, and each stanza has got 7 lines, and each line has got either 7 or 8 syllables. It kind of changes around just a little bit. And so these numbers, for the medieval mind, they are very symbolic. So the number 4 can refer to the earth. If you remember the alphabet ceremony, It's got 4 corners of the earth, the 4 evangelists, the 4 elements, lots of things with 4. And then 7, that can represent the church as a whole, the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit. It represents the Virgin Mary. She had 7 sorrows and 7 joys. And then Eugenius gave an indulgence to the Florentine people of 7 years and 7 quarantines, which means 40 days. So all of this is sort of coming together. And then also 4 times 7 is 28. And each duet and each 4-part section lasts for 28 measures. Isn't that incredible? It's all sort of baked into this piece of music. We also have important ratios here. So the whole piece, these kind of 4 parts, has a ratio of 6:4 to 2:3. And this, according to scholarship on this piece of music, is associated with the temple of King Solomon. We read in the Bible, it was 60 cubits long, 20 wide, 30 high, and then the portico was also 20 cubits. So you've got sort of 20 plus 20 gives you the 40 there. And this was the only time really in the Bible where we have a description of architecture, where Solomon was given very precise instructions. And that's the temple, isn't it? And you'll notice in the poem, they don't use the word church, they use the word temple. And this image in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, it's from pretty much the same time period as all this is going on. It depicts the temple, but it's in the guise of Florence Cathedral. So we've got that kind of relationship there coming out really nicely. So the poem I'm just describing, that's what David and I are going to sing on the top lines. But then Phyllis and Walter, who are singing the basso continuo at the bottom, they're singing completely different words to us. And this is crazy. Like, this hardly ever happens. And they want me to tell you that the parts are actually written for tenors, and neither of them are tenors. So we have the alto and bass here trying their best, because David's our only tenor right now. So he's on the top line with me. And so these 4 words that they're going to be singing is terribilis est locus iste. How awesome is this place? And this phrase, this was used for the introit for the dedication of the church traditionally. And it comes from Genesis with Jacob. After sleep, he was afraid and said, "How awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven." So whereas David and I were going to be singing something extremely florid and complicated on top, Phyllis and Walter are going to be doing something completely different, much more medieval sounding than the kind of Renaissance polyphony that we're doing. And Walter's just going to demonstrate that for you. Thank you. You can stay there. You can stay there. Okay. You probably don't need to. Oh, what can we do? Put it down.
I'll just say one of the odd bits about this to me is that a word, even a word that's only one syllable, gets broken. So you start the vowel sound, and then you pause for quite a long time, and then you come back and pick it up again.
It's super weird.
So we're very much the Cantus Firmus, the song that is the firm foundation, essentially, the foundation piece that the very florid cathedral is being built on.
Thank you. Thanks, Walter. Let's give him a clap. He deserves it. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. So I've already said this part about flores and florentiae and about the rose. Also, we can remember that the Florentine coat of arms is a lily. So we have lots and lots of flowers as part of this. We do have some images of this event. So we have manuscript illuminations that show Eugenius and the cardinals, and also the papal choir. That's the choir who sang this piece. We can see that there, and even Terribilis Est is at the base of this manuscript page. And we're not exactly sure at what point in the whole ceremony this piece was sung. So it could have been as the introit. It could have been at the dedication of the high altar, when relics would be inserted into the altar. It could have been after the credo, at the elevation of the host. We're not exactly sure. But we know that it was a major event. The attendance of the event, this consecration, it was attended by the Florentine government, the Pope and the Curia, of course, leading humanists and artists, architects, musicians, including Brunelleschi himself and Dufay, who wrote the piece, and the Florentine citizenry. And so we read Manetti, a Florentine humanist and eyewitness. He said, at the elevation of the consecrated host, all the places of the temple resounded with the sounds of harmonious symphonies of voices, as well as the concords of diverse instruments, so that it seemed not without reason that the angels and the sounds of singing and of divine paradise had been sent from heaven to us on earth to insinuate in our ears a certain incredible divine sweetness. So there's no pressure on us then to give you this sense of the paradise. Okay, and if you're interested, there's lots been written about this. If you want to follow up on anything that I've said, there are tons of resources about the motet, about the cathedral. Okay, oh my gosh, we're gonna do it. We're gonna do it. So should we move the just a little bit? Okay, you give us the light. Thank you so much. You see why it's taken me like 1.5 years to learn that piece of music. Oh my gosh. So does anyone have any questions? Emily, do we have a roving mic at all?
Would that have been a very difficult piece of music for contemporary people at that time, or would that have been?
Thank you. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, Dufay is known as being one of the most difficult Renaissance composers to sing. There's a lot of syncopation in the piece. The notes themselves aren't so difficult, but for David and I, just kind of sort of locking in with some of the rhythms is very, very difficult. So yeah, definitely difficult.
Here, I got one.
Okay, thank you.
I now understand how we get Florentiae.
Yes.
How do we go from that to Firenze?
So Firenze is the Italian and Florencia is the Latin. I feel like with a lot of place names in Italy, they would add a Z when they're making it into Italian. I guess it's just a pronunciation thing. I'm not exactly sure. I'm not so much of a linguist, but I'm thinking of Venetia goes to Venezia as well. It is still related to the idea of the flourishing, flowering city. Yeah, Bob. Anita.
That was just beautiful. Did you all sing from the original notation, or did you transcribe it to modern notation?
Yeah, this is a good question about the original notation. Though we used modern notation, so in this time period they would have used part books. So each part would have had separate parts, and the notation. The 15th century is a time when notation is changing. We have mensural notation coming in with an additional line in the staff. So before that, there would have been 4 lines for some of the more medieval Gregorian chant and things like that. And then this 5th line is added to make it mensural notation. And the notes themselves become a little smaller and more connected together in the notation as the music gets increasingly more difficult. We sang at modern pitch, yeah. Do you think the pitch was? Yeah, Bob. Whatever pitch it was, it ended up at, yeah.
Was there any type of musical accompaniment to the singing?
Probably not to that piece we've just sung, but when Eugenius was walking between Santa Maria Novella and the Duomo, there would have been string, I have it in my notes, there would have been trumpeters and maybe string players as well accompanying him. Music tends not to be accompanied at this time. There might have been maybe an organ helping out the basso continuo, but probably not anything else. Yeah,
Would
Andrew.
it be sung only by 4 people, or might you have larger
No.
group with?
Yeah, many more people.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, yeah. So the papal choir as a whole, and it would have been boys singing my line, as we saw in the manuscript illumination. There were boys singing there. So we felt like this was hard enough just for us to sing. I wouldn't like to ask anyone else to sort of join me on my part, because then if I screw up, no one knows. I know. Yeah, we definitely get a point for bravery. Yeah, Jane.
So you just answered my question in a way, but I'm assuming it was all men at the time. And was it mixed boys sopranos or grown men as sopranos in that time?
Yeah, it could have been male castrati as well.
Right, that went
sure.
on for a long time, I guess. Do you know
Yes.
when women were allowed to sing in the church? I'm curious about that.
They are not allowed to sing in the papal choir.
Wow, I
still.
didn't know. Wow.
Yeah. So
Well, there you go. And if
yeah,
you
the
if
papal
you all
choir
haven't heard
is-
this sermon, there's a bit about Christianity this morning being the original feminist movement. So that's an interesting piece in light of that.
debatable. All male choir. There was actually the Catholic Church put out a document in I think it was 1905, around then. So not too long ago, saying women shouldn't sing in church choirs. Yeah, I know. Scandalous. Yeah.
Well, if no other questions, please, another round of applause for.
Thank you. Thank you.
Joanne, you got more? You have something more? So I want to again thank Joanne. I want to actually recognize David Geyer, who's walking out the door, Phyllis Fong, and Walter Smith for their participation today. Aren't we blessed to have such incredible artistic and musical knowledge and ability here? So yes, we're so blessed to have such great art historian here on as part of St. John's, and such great musical talent. So we are indeed blessed. Let me quickly make a couple of announcements. One, if you haven't had your photograph taken for the directory, you can still do it right now before the service in the lounge. And Joanne Allen is there ready to take your photograph, and it doesn't take us very long at all. The next big signature event for the 150th is coming up on Saturday, November the 18th at 7:30 in the sanctuary. We will have 2 ensembles from the Gay Men's Chorus of DC. So it's going to be a really fun evening. Seasons of Love and Potomac Fever are the 2 ensembles, and one is an a cappella group. One is a group with piano accompaniment, and it should be a really great evening. So we encourage you to come. It's free. So please come, bring your friends, bring your family. It's a great date night. There'll be 2 45-minute sets with an intermission in between, and I promise really good food. So we hope you'll come that evening. Thank you. And thanks again.